Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We're really excited to be gathering today and talking a little bit about conspiracy-based polarization and the climate emergency centers in the UK, and learn from Dr. Mary Stockdale, who spent the year last year in the UK learning all this stuff. And we get to hear kind of some of her findings and her thoughts, and we'll have a little bit of time for discussion and questions afterwards. I know a lot of these issues are really relevant for the province at the moment. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from all the way actually out east in Mi'kma'ki in Chibuktuk. But I really welcome you all to introduce yourselves in the chat and say where you're coming from, acknowledging the traditional stewards of the land that you're joining from, as we kind of keep that in mind during this call. So we'll be having a little presentation from Dr. Mary Stockdale, and then we'll go into some question and answers, and then we'll go into a discussion period. So really excited to learn with you all today, and thank you so much again for joining. I'll pass it on to my colleague Michelina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm joining from Tiohtià:ke, commonly known as Montreal, more on the East Coast as well. And so today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Mary Stockdale, who has made climate action her priority since the early 2000s and is an original founder of Climate Action Now of the North Okanagan, together with Bill Darnell. She was also a chair of the Climate Action Advisory Committee of the City of Vernon during the development of the community's climate action plan. Mary is also an adjunct professor in human geography at the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus, where she teaches and does research in sustainability and the environment, with her special topics being, number one, public engagement in climate action, and two, resilient regional food systems. In her 2019 to 2020 sabbatical in the UK, she worked as a project manager for Climate Outreach, a leading climate communications organization. In 2004, she was named Vernon's Leader of the Year. Over to you, Mary.
Okay, I'll just do my share. I'll stop admitting people. I was having so much fun with that. I got distracted. Hand it back to you, Hope. Okay, let's get my slides up here. And can people tell me if they're seeing the main slide and not the presenter notes?
All good.
Good. So it's nice to see you all, and I'm really looking forward to this talk and the discussion. So I'm going to try really hard to keep myself within the allotted time. Let me just set my timer to remind myself. Yeah. So so today I'm going to be talking about conspiracy-based polarization and climate emergency centers in the UK, learnings for BC. I must admit, I'm not as far along as I would have liked on doing my thinking about this due to finishing up teaching and other responsibilities of the term and a few family matters. But I am thinking that this talk is an opportunity to gather my ideas together to present to you, and also to gather the wisdom of the group together to inspire me when I move on to do more work on this in the upcoming months. Both research work and potentially community work, now that I have the time. So here's an outline for what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences in climate engagement, and then I'm going to talk a bit about where we find ourselves now, which is conspiracy-based polarization increasing, new approaches needed. And so then I'll go on to list a few possible approaches, old and new, for climate engagement, and single out one in particular, which is from a new approach from the UK, which is climate emergency centers. And then we're going to hopefully have plenty of time for discussion. And we're going to divide into two sections. Okay, so my experience in climate engagement, which is really shorthand for public engagement in climate action. So I just shortened that to climate engagement. It comes from two sources. I had a short but intense burst of learning when I went for sabbatical to the UK in the fall of 2019 through to the spring of 2020, which was COVID craziness. And then I came back to Canada, but I ended up working with a group called Climate Outreach in Oxford, UK. And the work went on from my time there through to COVID times back in Canada. So I worked for them for about a year. The other source of experience in climate engagement is the main source is my ongoing 18-year commitment to a process of public engagement and climate action in my hometown of Vernon. So I'm going to talk about both of them in turn. So yeah, as I said earlier, I got a job with Climate Outreach while I was in the UK in 2019, 2020, and for a while longer after that. It was for a year in all. And Climate Outreach is one of the world's leading climate communications organizations, and they've been doing this work longer than just about anyone. And what they do is climate communications research, advice, and training, with their main aim being to widen public engagement on climate change to new audiences beyond the usual converted crowd. And this is based on their Climate Outreach's theory of change, which says that, if you look at the upper left-hand figure, we're currently trapped in a vicious cycle where, because there's a weak social mandate, not enough of the public care to make climate action a priority, and so you have weak climate policies, corporations not being incentivized to change, and everyone's high carbon emitting behaviors continue. So their theory of change is that we need to focus through public engagement on climate change on building a much broader social mandate beyond just the usual environmentalists, to far more people seeing climate action as a priority, because then you get transformative climate policies, incentivized corporations, and finally new social norms promoting people to follow low carbon emitting behaviors. So my work at Climate Outreach was to initiate and successfully obtain funding as project manager for an initiative called the Climate Engagement Initiative. And its overarching objective was to catalyze a step change in national governments and relevant international policy bodies in both the quantity and quality of broad-based public engagement on climate change. So the COVID experience has only reinforced that national governments need to invest much more strongly in high quality public engagement if they want to achieve good outcomes. And we can only look at, say, how Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand managed COVID crisis compared to Donald Trump. And it was really all much due to good public engagement. Same is true for climate action. And so there were various arenas. We kind of made the case for public engagement in the global idea space. There were plans for interventions at international forums and also a lot of support, really mainly for national governments. It was really exciting to be involved in this high level of work, and I learned a lot from it. So climate engagement, which, as I said before, is public engagement in climate action, what is it? It's not really communications, it's not really education and awareness raising, it's not really outreach, it's something that is much more about a two-way flow, where forming solutions and making decisions becomes shared to some extent between the initiators or leaders or facilitators and the public. So we need to talk with people, not just to them. We need to interact and involve people, not just inform them. So there's been a lot of research on climate engagement, and including in this climate engagement initiatives, part of what they did in that project. And here are some of the key principles of public engagement. The first one is to create truly meaningful, inclusive, and participatory approaches. So that's where you get that two-way flow and that shared solution finding and decision making. It's also really important. I spent a lot of time talking about actually this subject of climate engagement, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just very briefly, the values, we need to connect with people's deeply held values, and they have to be ones that are shared across a wide breadth of society rather than any that might become divisive. And some research has found that some common values are things like health, a balance between human and nature, preserving the countryside, fairness, protecting the people and communities we love, autonomy, energy security and safety, environmental protection, passing over a good world to our children. So these are uniting values. The point about engaging positive and cultural and social norms is that a key way to do that is through peer-to-peer public engagement, because when you create settings where people can engage with their peers who are taking action on climate change, other people start to come to see this as normal, because they're seeing that people like themselves are engaged and active on climate change. And finally, stories. It's very important to find ways of setting out a narrative about climate change and its solutions that honestly acknowledges the risks of climate change, the dangers, but also points to realistic and credible options for tackling it. It's really vital to create a sense of empowerment. All right, so now back down to the local level. This is the other place where I do community climate engagement, and that's in my own community of Vernon, BC. So, oops, I went too fast there. So way back in 2011, I formed a group now known as Climate Action Now with Bill Darnell, who is one of the founders of Greenpeace, incidentally, and who also lived in Vernon. So we were a bit of a dream team for many years. He's now moved on to Victoria. In 2016, so about 8 years ago, Bill and I decided we needed to step up, try to step things up at the local level. So we went to a number of local governments, including Vernon, to ask for more ambitious climate action. So Vernon was responsive, and they proposed to organize a committee to help in the process of developing a climate action plan. So the Climate Action Advisory Committee was formed and launched in the fall of 2018. And its mandate was to advise the City of Vernon in the development and implementation of a climate action plan. So I was one of the co-chairs, so was Bill, and so was Brian. We kind of traded off when people had to go away on sabbaticals or other leaves. And we had 3 working groups, one focused on mitigation, one on adaptation, and of course, my passion was the one that looked at community engagement. There were a lot of community engagement activities in the planning phase when we were developing our climate action plan. The main one I wanted to highlight was our climate ambassador program, where we recruited and trained a team of over 30 climate ambassadors, including youth ambassadors, who reached over 1,000 people using an interactive, customized 20-minute slide presentation. And actually the inspiration for this came from a friend in climate outreach. So the result, we ended up with a climate action plan. The council voted to adopt it in April 2021. It's since won a Planning Institute Gold Award in the category of Excellence in Policy Planning, Small Town and Rural Communities. And to quote the people who granted the award, Vernon's Climate Action Plan sets out a clear path to enhance community resilience to anticipated climate impacts. It also helps to address the goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Vernon's Climate Action Plan and the engagement process used to create it has become a model of interest to other communities in the Okanagan and British Columbia. So there was a lot of interest in the ambassador program, and I think we had an article. Laura encouraged me to write an article at one point, and so on. I think I've talked about it before to this group. So now we went on in Vernon on to the implementation phase, and found that there were obstacles. We had a lot of disasters, the pandemic. We had a real lack of staff capacity that was ongoing, almost chronic in the city of Vernon. So that really was a barrier to getting anything done within the structures of the Climate Action Advisory Committee and its ambassador program. There really felt like there was more than that to it, though. There really seemed to be a reluctance to take political risks in the implementation phase. And in the end, I kind of got a message from someone that said, this is from someone higher up in the hierarchy of the staff, which was that, you know, we really just should do communications and outreach, not engagement. So our conclusion was, from myself and Bill and a few sort of key people, that we needed to do climate engagement a little bit at arm's length. So we would continue working closely with the city of Vernon, but not too closely, so that we could kind of go off and do this without these barriers kind of getting in our way. And that's where we're at right now. And we're trying to think about what the best way to do this would be for the implementation phase, now that we have the plan. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the issue of where we're at now. So where we're at now is we're doing arm's length climate engagement in Vernon, thinking about new approaches, but we're also thinking about the fact that conspiracy-based polarization is increasing. Now, when I was thinking about giving this talk to you, I thought, you know what, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, because there have been a lot of great webinars recently about this issue by Climate, which is the Canadian equivalent and in fact an offshoot of Climate Outreach. There's been some great talks by UBC PhD student and former municipal planner Wes Regan, and I really recommend those to you. And I can give you links for Hope to send out later if you haven't seen them already. And these are directly related to how this kind of polarization is influencing climate action in both BC and Canada. And there's, of course, a lot of other interesting books, academic papers, articles, podcasts, and recordings as well on the topic. So I thought I wouldn't really spend time on it, especially the causes. Even though I've been trying to do research on this, I thought I'd try to focus mainly on solutions. But actually, there's not so many in the literature, and I think I'm still feeling my way, and that's where I hope our discussion will help me get a little bit further. But I'll try to do what I can. So just to quickly summarize the problem, I really thought that Wes Regan did a good job of it as it relates to climate action at the local level. He talks about conspiracist rhetoric about planning is being used to resist change. And he brings this really interesting concept up called the conservative impulse, which is basically not really just for conservative people, because some very left-wing people are also feeling this impulse. It's basically a reaction against change and an experience of profound dislocation and grief when change is occurring. West describes it as being similar to that of a widow losing a partner. Some people stay stuck forever in those feelings. Others move through the feelings and onto a new normal. So this is kind of the process some people are hitting as climate change starts to affect us and change the world around us. And challenge, us in some very fundamental ideas around our identity and our way of life. Secondly, he talks about planning, how planning associated with climate action sustainability appears a common target. And then he says the conspiracist rhetoric helps people in the public reframe and misrepresent planning concepts and other topics. This then spreads quickly through social media, and there's a lot about that and about the creation of bubbles and so on. It casts doubt on science, technical expertise, and many forms of knowledge, and also on institutions like government and academia. It also recasts planners and other officials as villains in conspiracist plots. And all of this brings an emotional intensity to the arguments of conspiracy thinkers, and you find them disrupting and delaying deliberation in governments on climate action in ways that we have never seen previously. Okay, solutions. Okay, like I said, I'm still feeling my way a bit on solutions, but some of what needs to happen is at higher levels of government. It needs to happen in the media. It needs to happen in the way algorithms are set up online. So there's a lot of things that are kind of beyond our control, but I can't help but feel, and this is just sort of me trying to find my way here, that a lot of the solution is at the community level, and that's where I work anyway, and so that's where my focus should be. I feel like when people are getting all this stuff online, that our one advantage is that we are actually tangible, physical people in the same neighborhood, in the same community as these people who are starting to be, taken in on the online social media kind of conspiracies. So when people really don't know what to believe, who to believe, what to hold on to, we remain something real that they can actually see. And I've actually have to say, doing deep canvassing in my community recently, I really felt that sense of people feeling isolated, confused, sucked into conspiracy thinking, mistrusting many of our institutions, but still like really grateful to see someone come to their door and want to talk to them. So yeah. So I'm just going to go on to a few points. I think that one of the things we got out of Wes Regan's talk is that he felt people need to be helped to move through this conservative impulse, to move through their fear of change, their feelings of grief. We need to find ways to empathize with how people are feeling and actually agree with them that they're not totally crazy. There's usually a kernel of truth in much of what they're saying. There, kernel of truth there about maybe our governments kind of not always having people's interests at heart, that there's influences by corporations and all that sort of thing. It's a confusing thing because of that kernel of truth. And related to the above, point number 2, we need to learn about green populism strategies. This comes from a Reclimate webinar around talking about things like green transition and positioning ordinary people against a global elite but in our case, fossil fuel industries, politicians who are very much in hand with those fossil fuel industries, etc. Another one is just around addressing misinformation. Pre-bunking is better than debunking is one of the things I learned, because once people have kind of accepted a conspiracy theory, it's very hard to shake them off of it. But if we are trying to do that, if we're trying to do debunking, it's very, very important to find respected messengers to engage and inform the audiences that are caught in these echo chambers. Another idea about solutions is, this is kind of just one that I came up with in brainstorming session I had with friends locally. We were looking at some of the webinars and having a bit of a book club discussion about them. And people were saying that we need to remind people of the ground rules and appeal to their better selves. Maybe their sense of being Canadian, that Canadians are decent people. When they're starting to be aggressive, emotional, disruptive in public events. And we were reminded of that because in Wes Regan's talk, he mentioned the McCarthy era hearings and how one person really changed the tone of those hearings when he sort of said, "Have you no decency, sir," to McCarthy. And we thought of this other one from Nenshi, "Danielle, I know you're better than this." So there's something there, perhaps, as neighbors, as community members, that we can remind people of. A fifth point is also from Reclimate's webinar. They said we need to find ways to tell stories that bring hope to people who are feeling afraid or disengaged. Show concrete examples of people that they might look up to who are working successfully in renewable energy, for example. So this is actually some of those key principles of climate engagement. And this idea that people are feeling afraid or disengaged, that in some ways we're helping people with poor mental health who are feeling lonely and isolated. It kind of rang true for me in this next slide, even though this is about people feeling eco-anxiety, and therefore kind of the opposite people who actually really do believe that climate change is real and that we ought to be doing something about it, like many of our youth who have reported that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are interfering with daily life tasks. But in a similar way to the conspiracists, they feel their thoughts and feelings are associated with a sense of being failed by leaders and lied to by governments. And they're experiencing this sort of isolation and mental health crisis. And this paper I read by Ray in 2023, it was actually a presentation. She said, we need to help people move away from individualism towards distributed collective power by working together at a local level as a key mental illness prevention strategy. And there's all sorts of benefits of that, including that it really helps us be a more resilient community in the face of climate disturbance. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts about polarization. So we recently brainstormed some approaches for managing polarization. And here are some of them that I've tried out, and you probably all have too. And I look forward to talking with you about them later. But well, I guess what I really want to talk about is that down at the bottom right, at some point in my research and my looking at what's going on in different parts of the world, I heard about climate emergency centers in the UK and started looking into them. So later, when my husband and I spent a term last fall in 2023 in the UK again, I decided to do some direct research. So what I did is I kind of went out there and looked at all the network materials of the climate emergency centers. They have a handbook, they have a website, Facebook, YouTube recordings. I had a chance to interview or talk basically with the coordinator. I joined the WhatsApp group, which I'm still looking at. It's a very active group. And also I looked at individual climate emergency centers, looked at quite a few websites and Facebook pages, and I got the chance to visit two physically and go and see what the actual centers looked like, one in Totnes and one in Swindon. So I'm going to do a quick run through of some slides that are actually made freely available to us by the Climate CEC Network Coordinator, John Durham. So climate emergency centers are self-funding centers that bring together an alliance of diverse people, groups, and individuals in the community to build solutions, relationships, and resilience in the face of the climate emergency. Their aim is to create space for community-led solutions and a sustainable future for all. So it has a solutions focus for people and planet. It's local and inclusive, focused on reconnecting and meeting community needs. It's an active part of a wider network for mutual support and cooperation. Every center is autonomous and names itself, but they do ask that the word CEC network be included somewhere, somehow. The Climate Emergency Centers project has grown out of 30 years of grassroots environmental community center projects, which began in 1992 after the Rio Earth Summit. The group behind these earlier efforts is called Space Generators, and it's really just a very specialized group that's focused on the logistics of obtaining free or low-cost building space in central community areas for community use, whether for environmental, social, or cultural purposes. So the knowledge from this experience has been collated into the CEC handbook. So the name climate emergency centers, it really comes from a sort of big movement in the UK, I think probably broader than here in Canada, where councils passed motions declaring a climate emergency. And here's a map of over 300 councils that have declared to date. But many local councils were hamstrung by budget cuts and the fact that many policy decisions that mitigate climate chaos are in the mandate of central government or county councils. Another problem with kind of acting on the climate emergency is that, or actually this is just another issue, is that many community spaces have been lost due to austerity. So there's a real lack of community space from which to act locally. So they decided that this is a solution to form these physical spaces where they could engage the wider community to drive meaningful action on not just the climate crisis, but on things like food poverty, fuel poverty, and homelessness in the communities. And so you can see there's a lot of different activities that the centers have been able to take on simply by being able to provide that physical space. The movement started, the very first climate emergency center was formed in Ilford, but it's been growing ever since through COVID and beyond. And so I'm going to now just show you the steps that listed in the handbook, starting with building a team, figuring out whether you're a charity or a nonprofit, building relationships with the community, forming that alliance, gathering resources, finding a space, and then getting organized. So the first one, the build your team, right away they say it's important to start having sort of working groups. And the working groups are four. One's looking at the legal entity, one's looking at outreach, one's looking at specifically the relationship with council, and a final one is just looking at finding a building. The handbook really focuses on practical details about getting a space. And so they say, you know, either as a not-for-profit or as a charity in the UK, you can do something called a meanwhile lease, which means a property owner can save up to 100% of their business rate costs on the building if a charity or nonprofit leases it from them. And that money, their savings, can be partially or fully, if they want, donated to the CEC to help fund it. So they kind of, I mean, they're also saying that the council, as opposed to a private owner of a building, may also be willing to give you a building on a meanwhile or short-term lease. So the way they describe it, I'm not sure that this would work in the same way in Canada, and it's something I'm in the process of exploring. But basically, there is this kind of way in which building owners can make savings if something like a CEC it takes a lease on that property. That really helps and facilitates and makes it easier to kind of set such centers up. I'm also not going to spend too much time on these incomings and outgoings, but basically the aim is for a self-funding project, mainly through things like the income being generated from the space itself, you know, various enterprises like cafes being set up in it. But there's also a fair amount of reliance for staff on volunteers. There's benefits for the building owner who can save money. They're giving back to their community. They're building relationships with council and community. But also, if they have an empty building, there's less vandalism and there's protection for the premises and there's 24-hour care. Benefits for the council in all sorts of ways. Climate action is enhanced. Prevents building dilapidation, community re-engagement, etc. There's benefits for the community as well, as we've been talking all the way through in terms of what such centers can provide. So it's a win-win-win for council, property owner, and community. And who can use it? There's a real range of people who could potentially be part of the alliance that uses the center. And here's a map of all the centers that exist so far. So the red is all the 20 teams that are just in that team forming for step one of trying to get things organized. But there's 31, the dots in green, that have actually formed physical centers. There's also a network that supports the CECs. And incidentally, they say it's a project that takes about 3 to 6 months to set up a center. I'm interested to hear that. But basically, the network provides support in that setup stage and subsequently. And there's not only the handbook, but there's all these chat groups. There's also a Zoom meeting every Wednesday from 7 to 8 p.m. for the network. And there's a sort of network support team that can try to help and advise and act as support. So here are some of the different ways in which people can be linked up. And so now I'm just going to quickly talk about the 2 centers I visited. So one is in Totnes, and here's the photo of the entrance. There's lots of things going on in this building besides the Totnes Climate Change Response Center, which is the name of this CEC. There's a really good and popular vegan cafeteria. There's a bicycle repair space, and I didn't really get to explore all the rest, but it's this lovely old building in the main street of Totnes. Their goals that they describe on their Facebook site are that they're a center that informs, inspires, and enables our local community to live in a more sustainable and resilient manner. It's a hub for all of the local amazing projects, businesses, groups, and schemes that each are involved with, helping us respond sensibly and effectively to the climate and ecological crisis that we are facing. Yeah, so here is what it looks like inside the center. There are volunteers there who come and greet you and offer a cup of tea and a chance to sit and ask questions. There's a sort of meeting space in the far back there. There was a financial advisor there when we visited who was available for drop-in one-to-one discussions about ethical investments. That just happened to be what was happening. But on another day, it might be something like a climate-related book club or a knitting circle, or I'm not sure what all the other activities were. You can see that all around are displays that are showing kind of how to take action on climate change, whether it's food or political action or transportation or taking care of community well-being. There were a lot of different topics. Totnes is a bit of an alternative hippie community. It's in Devon. It's the site of a BBC series called Conspirituality, on how conspiracy theories have merged with alternative spirituality and wellness. And so there's a recent article by George Monbiot, like very recent, in The Guardian, about such a person, a conspiracy theorist in Totnes, who he has a sort of debate with, that gives you an idea of what's going on there. So I did ask the volunteers about how they manage people influenced by conspiracy theories, and they told me that they have a policy of not arguing about climate change with such people, but if the people want to just come and engage with the resilience building activities in a peaceful way, they're very welcome. But if they're behaving in a way that makes the volunteers uncomfortable or that is disruptive, they're asked to leave. The Swindon Hub is, unlike Totnes, Swindon is an urban community, quite working class. There's a car making industry and other industries. There's currently high unemployment. This is a 2-story building in the shopping center. It used to be an old Patagonia camping equipment store. And there's now the Swindon Hub and all sorts of activities going on in there. It's existed now for 2 years. And what really interesting point is that the real estate agent told the people who set this up that the hub, by existing, has pulled the life back into the whole shopping complex. So that's one of those benefits for the council and the community. So this is how they describe their purpose. The challenge is social inequity, economic decline, environmental crisis. Their vision to build a strong, cohesive, sustainable community. They plan to achieve this by facilitating accessible spaces for groups and individuals to create, meet, work, play, discuss, learn, and share resources. So this is their long lower floor. There's volunteers come to meet and greet. There's a poster area and cork boards about what's going on. There's an exhibition space for art. There's a shop with local crafts and kind of clothing, reused clothing and other items. There's a sort of pool table, music, snug books, sofas place. There's a cafe that's a vegan cafe. There's a child-friendly play area.
Hi, the 1 o'clock for Nanaimo name is Hogan.
Oh. Sorry, is that for me?
No, go ahead. I think it was just someone who accidentally came off of mute.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the lower floor. It's quite lovely. There's a beautiful space upstairs, which can be used for group activities. There's qigong classes, there's knitting, there's creative writing. And interestingly, all of these classes and workshops are offered for free. But there's also money-making opportunities they rent out the store display space, they rent out sometimes the art gallery, the cafe is running, at a profit, and so on. What I found with Swindon is they're more oriented to social advocacy and much less to environmental issues, but they do have a vegan cafe, and there's a real ethic of reuse, recycle, like their sort of repair cafe activities and so on. I did ask the volunteer who was showing me around about conspiracy theory people, and he kind of started talking about it a little bit, but it turned out, as far as I can understand, that he was a little bit of a one himself. But there he was being a volunteer, and he was a very nice fellow. So my general impressions, I've long been involved with the climate activist movement in the UK, and what I've learned, or what I came to understand, was that a lot of people in this climate emergency centers come from the Extinction Rebellion movement, the recent Extinction Rebellion movement, where they kind of had a schism, and some of them decided to become Just Stop Oil and become much more radical in what they were doing in terms of protest activities, nonviolent direct action, like stopping roads and so on, art gallery, throwing soup on art and so on. And another substantial group of people said, let's just not do any of that anymore. Let's turn back to the community. And they are the ones who've turned back to the climate emergency centers to found them. But there's a huge interesting overlap and kind of rejoining of the transition town movement. And a lot of the kind of style and the way of talking about transition towns has reappeared in these climate emergency centers, which I find fascinating. So the themes are mainly, it's all about creating a space. That's what distinguishes these climate emergency centers. A means of building community cohesion and an alliance, meeting people where they're at, addressing very much the cost of living crisis that's consuming people in the UK, even more than in Canada, but it's also a huge thing here. A real focus on community-specific approaches, being autonomous, but having this network that provides support. And the polarization issue, they're aware of the issue. They're trying to accept people as part of the community and not necessarily try to change their minds, but asking them to leave when they overstep the ground rules. And I guess maybe I would like to quote, do I have time? No, I think we're running out of time. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, let's go on to discussions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mary. That was really interesting. I think, yeah, first of all, round of applause. Before we go into discussions, I realized that some people have asked in private, like if the discussions and the recording will and the questions will be recorded. So I just want to make sure and just poll the room here right now that if we were to continue recording through any questions or discussions, are there any concerns with that? And if there are, you can privately message me at this very moment. And if there, like if you don't feel comfortable, just raising your hand. And if I'll give that like 2 minutes, and then if all goes well, I'll just keep recording just so that people who have to leave early can still have a little bit of participation in that more discussion side of things. But before we start the discussion, we'll do a quick little 6-minute question period, just so that in case there are just some thoughts right away before we go into some larger discussions. Also, I'm seeing no opposition, so I'm just going to keep the recording rolling. And if you're worried afterwards, feel free to get in touch with me, and I can always cut out any kind of piece afterwards before we post it. But yeah, so let's take this next 6 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Tracy, go ahead.
There we go. Yeah, so thanks, Mary. My question is around, there's a lot of volunteerism. And I think that's where the people that I know in various groups, that's where you kind of hit the brick wall, is finding people that will actually get involved. And I'm just wondering how they overcome that. Is that because they're speaking with people as opposed to at people and making them more involved, or how is that kind of addressed?
I don't know how or why I don't know how they recruit volunteers. I just know that that's who was manning these centers when I went. But I have to say I share that concern. I think it probably in smaller communities, it gets harder and harder for us to think, where are we going to find people to do this? And so, I do understand that and share it. I'm contemplating, this approach in Vernon, and I am wondering, is this the best use of my energy and time, or are these other approaches, which I listed on that slide, better? So I'm really just, I was curious. I found out about it. I'm telling you about it as a tool. But whether it's the best one for a given community, I'm not sure. I think, you have to kind of assess. But when I think of it in a different way, from do we have the capacity to do it? When I think of it just in the way of what's the best way of trying to meet people, it appeals to me. It appeals to me as providing solutions for people that like repair cafes and just really tangible, addressing cost of living crises and inequality, while also having a chance to have dialogues and build cohesion, and maybe build in some thinking around resilience and climate action. And so, I'm also very fond of deep canvassing and a number of other approaches, but there's something about this one that keeps appealing to me. I keep getting tempted to do it, even though I also wonder if we can manage it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, Hannah, go ahead.
Can everyone hear me okay? My internet all right? Okay. Thanks, Mary. It's nice to see you again. That was really a really interesting presentation, and I never heard of the climate emergency centers before. I was just wondering if you could clarify or elaborate, and I hope I didn't miss this, but I'm wondering about the relationship in between the councils and these centers. Do the centers actually receive funding from the councils? I guess that's one question. And related to that, like, did this start? I know you said it grew out of like councils declaring climate emergencies, but was there like that first council that established one and then it kind of grew in this decentralized way? Like, yeah, it's a really interesting, I think, example of something that was like kind of decentralized, but then also became this like network thing. So
Yeah. I don't think it is council run. I don't think any of them are. I think they're very much grassroots. Yeah, and I think that they right away do reach out and establish a relationship with council. So it's kind of what was interesting for me was that that's sort of where I was at in Vernon as well, thinking we want something arm's length where we kind of are free to do what we want without the constraints of being within a council environment, but we still really want to work with our council very closely because they've got an excellent climate action plan, and they're great allies. So I think that's really what's happening in these other places as well in the UK. Yeah.
Awesome.
Is that your full question?
well, I guess, yeah, the second part, if you know, was like, was there an example of like the first people to have the idea to form one, I guess, and it kind of like spread from there? Or yeah, it's like, what was that
Yeah, that I don't know.
process like?
That I don't know, I'm afraid. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how the spark of the idea took.
I'll look at their website maybe after this. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I
it's
couldn't
a
find
cool
it
example.
there. And I feel like it's somewhat maybe had already happened in the transition town movement. A lot of what they took on had already existed in the form of kind of, there were some, like in Totnes, especially where the transition movement originated, there were these hubs, kind of these spaces. There was a space, there was a lot going on in Totnes. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure though. Yeah.
Yeah, Peter. Oh, you're just on mute, so if you want to just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm in Kelowna, and I had a career in development cooperation. And one of the things you notice in development cooperation is that there's lots of money up front from international donors and various groups. But working with a group in Kelowna, I'm struck by the difficulty of getting access to funding for nonprofits, especially in the early stages. How were these institutions funded at the beginning? How did that work? I mean, because they seem quite complex structures with a lot of free services. How did that work?
I mean, first of all, I think they're a bit scruffy, and I mean, I think they benefit, first of all, I think they benefit from some sort of interesting arrangement around the lease, which means that cost doesn't seem to affect them. But they're a bit scruffy and underfunded, and I think that's part of their charm and a big asset for them, because when you're trying to reach people who are suspicious of government and who's controlling you and who's behind you and all this, and you turn out you're just a neighbor, you're just a community member who's trying to help other people in the community, and you're volunteers, and there's no money coming from really anywhere much. There's a lot of authenticity to that. I don't know, this is, but you still, I mean, the reality is we all still need some funding. I would say it's very important to have funding to cover the lease, to cover the expenses, to have some coordinator time. That's what I would want in Vernon. And they do have suggestions about how to try to make it a self-funding project through the, onward rental of the space for, if you have an art gallery or this or that, or a cafe, they have suggestions for it. And, they also talk about applying to grants. They talk about a number of ways to try to raise the funds. And in fact, quite a number of their webinars, their weekly webinars are about different ways to access some funding, different ways to generate funds from within the project, and so on. So it is an important consideration of theirs. And I would point you to the YouTube videos and so on. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, just in looking at time, I'm gonna move towards the discussion portion of the call, but if there's time at the end, we can get to any unanswered questions then. So you might have seen at that very last slide, Mary had a couple of questions. We're gonna put that onto, sorry, you hear my very creaky door. We're gonna use a Jamboard. I'll also share my screen so that everybody can see it. So if you're not super familiar with Jamboard, you can always type your answers in to the chat and I can put them on myself as well. But here we go. So feel free, Mary, if you want to moderate this, or I can as well. But this was one of the first questions that you kind of had alluded to regarding if you folks see potential for something like a climate emergency center in your community, and if yes, we've already kind of been talking about this in some of these questions already, but what would be needed in terms of space, infrastructure, what would be needed or popular for like programming and activities in terms of atmosphere, guiding principles to work for your particular context. So, if you are seeing this in front of you and you haven't used Jamboard, I think you can see my mouse, but you can always add things by using this little sticky note function, and then you can write your example here. And then if you click save, it'll just show up like this. So feel free to write whatever you feel the answer to this question is. You can write down your location as well if you would like to. Feel free also to make this more of a kind of true discussion space to put your hand up and kind of just address this question out loud as well. Okay, so we have someone enthusiastically saying, yes, I think lack of community is a main problem that leads to polarization. And then someone else is saying, definitely a consistent location as well. I saw someone in the chat kind of noting that an old church in their community actually could be a really good sense of space. I know there's been lots of discussion in this kind of like new secular age, but trying to fill that third space that churches really offer and have offered for so many generations. Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of keep the conversation rather than switching between windows here. One thought that came to mind is that we're seeing more of these resilience centers around emergency clean air, places for extreme heat, community gathering, and so there. In our region, in the West Kootenay, there's a lot of community halls that are sort of underutilized, and so I'm just kind of wondering, like at a very local, like these are rural areas, but this could be something that come together and use spaces that are already purposed for, coming together as communities, rather than, because we don't have these in our region, big cities where there's too many abandoned buildings that aren't being used that are actually habitable. So anyhow, that's just a thought in terms of, resilient centers possibly being able to be also used in this way. But I wasn't putting it on sticky notes, sorry.
No, it's great. That's really true. And emergency, there's often this sort of emergency centers that in Vernon, they're a regular feature.
I would love I'm not quite sure who exactly put the new Westminster. I'm looking at the names and trying to see if I recognize. But if anyone wants to speak up and speak to that, that would be great.
That was me, Hope. So Jennifer New West. Yeah, so that's 50,000 American. So I guess 70 something Canadian. And if they spend it within 6 months, there's another 150,000 American. So that's awarded to the city. So it would be, yeah, so we have to figure out how to spend that, or how they have to figure out how to spend that really, really quickly. They have a very good climate plan as well. And I think, the more people understand the evidence for, say, active transportation, heat pumps, solar panels, all those kinds of things, then we can move our community to having that plan actually be actualized quickly. So it's for youth. I think I would love to see the young people get involved in this. I don't know how we can influence our city to have it go that way. I'm deeply, deeply concerned that you get people together on climate and they talk about recycling and a whole bunch of things that distract from the actual problem and the actual solutions. But very much hopeful. Also, the Youth Climate Corps, the city is pushing for that. So I don't know if other people see the Youth Climate Corps as something that could be, that this could connect with as well.
That could be such a good combination. Yeah, having some I think of young people as being ideal for staffing something like this with all, sorts of enthusiasm and ideas. Yeah, very good points made about making sure that we tactically keep encouraging the larger actions and not just the recycling act type actions, if we really want to impact climate change. Yeah, thank you. Good points.
Nicolina, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, also, I guess it depends on where people work, but in the sense of volunteers, it could be cool to also make it kind of a co-working space at the same time, because I know you could volunteer while you work in a way, if you work remotely, especially for young people, because that could be really great to encourage people to be present and physical in the space and be able to, do small tasks while also working. Because I know a lot of people work remotely these days as well. So.
Yeah, I love that. Janet, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm, for those of you that don't know me, I'm the Youth Engagement Coordinator at Climate Reality Canada. And I got very excited, first of all, when I learned about or heard about the grant at New Westminster, because yeah, it's a really cool grant. And I think it's really awesome that so many cities around the world are being funded, and there's promises for even more funding if things are going well in those cities. And it's specifically for young people, which I'm extra excited about. And then the Youth Climate Corps mentioned, there's actually I'm volunteering with the Youth Climate Corps, the national, there's kind of two separate campaigns. So there's the BC one and there's the national one. They have a similar goal, but they're actually separate campaigns. They're friendly though, they're not competing. There's actually, we're having a very small in-person gathering, kind of just to brainstorm ideas, actually on Thursday. So some of the folks, the organizing team from Climate Reality, from Climate Emergency Unit, are actually going to be in Vancouver. But I instantly thought of when we were Mary, when you were describing the physical locations of having these hubs to be able to meet up at. I was like, wow, that's kind of exactly what's missing. It's the climate emergency units, Youth Climate Corps is trying to create that type of community, but they're I'm the person that put physical location, because I think that's important to have a solid base, because even for this Thursday event, which is a very small thing, we're probably going to have like 10 to 15 people. But like one of the big issues is like food is usually relatively easy. You can always also do a potluck, but like location, we need to find somewhere. And I think like if there's a concrete location that people can like reliably go to, it's super valuable. And that also helps build that community because people know that when they go there, there's probably going to be other people there that they can talk about things and discuss issues and move forward. And also I do like Lena's idea as well, like to have a space. And having that could even like be a co-working space. Like I work virtually, I always work out of a coffee shop. But if there's something like this, like I would be happy to work out of some other space where people are sharing that. So I don't want to take too much time, but also Mary, I loved your presentation. I got very excited because my instigation of my being a climate activist started in London during the global climate strikes. So yeah, anyhow, yeah, that's my point. Sorry.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, I might call on Lori if you feel comfy. I think that you bring up some really good points in your notes, just with the concern of where if in case your community doesn't have young people, or if just generally people alone to kind of really take the torch and lead. So I'm curious because I know you still had some really great successes despite these concerns, and so I'm curious how you kind of thinking
Hi. You're talking about me, right? Yeah. So we're in Penticton with First Things First Okanagan, and we're hunting for board members and volunteers to work. Although we have a long volunteer list, they want to do maybe an hour here or there. This is such an important idea, the concept of having a hub or somewhere where people could come in and meet. All of this takes dedication and commitment and the focus. And all of us are over 55. Some of us are over 70. And so we're not able to engage youth. There is a new group called the Penticton Neighborhood Association, and they're really busy with jobs and children. And the younger people are busy with school and work and planning their future. Although this is like really exciting in our community, I'm not sure how we would ever get that something like this going. And it's so important. It's so important to have this and to have a place where people can meet without being told what they should think or believe or do. To have those conversations. How do we get it started? How do we get people to devote time? Because as a volunteer activity, it takes a lot of work.
I totally sympathize. I share those thoughts. I'm from their sister community of Vernon, same size as Penticton, same situation. But I think it's like I've had experience in getting nonprofits off the ground, and it's sort of like at first you just have to get, it's sort of like you need to get a grant and you need to get someone who can then sort of be paid to take on, the setting up and coordinating, and like it sort of ends up being able to kind of self-fund itself. But it's always very hard at the beginning when it's just a group of volunteers saying, we need to get something going here, but all of us are volunteers, how do we get this off the ground? So it is always a challenge at the start, but there are ways sometimes when you just get that grant or that little lift to kind of, have it go from there. But the nonprofit world is tricky. And even then, there can be challenges. So I think that the idea of a network is also really interesting because they definitely support each other in kind of troubleshooting with a lot of these issues as they try to keep themselves organized and up and running.
Can I just ask a quick question? So are there other places that besides the UK that are doing this, or any states or provinces or Australia, or I'm just wondering if this is most just right now just UK based.
I did ask, and he said there is some international interest, but he didn't say anything very specific, the coordinator, so I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the kind of property aspect and the meanwhile benefits is really, it sounds really unique to the UK, and sounds like it would be, I mean, if that existed in even one province here, would be a huge benefit. So it really kind of points to the importance and preciousness of public space and preserving those public spaces, and trying to find them and try to carve out those enclaves when we can. I'm wondering if we should go to the next slide and the next
So,
question.
yeah. It's
Okay.
an interesting topic as well. It's another way of looking at the issue.
Can I just ask a question?
Oh yeah.
Like, I'm wondering about, like liability. If you're in a building, if something happens, who has the liability for that?
I don't know the full answer, but I do know that, one of the costs they showed in that slide was about insurance. And I mean, it's like any nonprofit, there are issues of risk and liability and insurance. I can't answer it more fully than that, Tracy.
Yeah, I wasn't really
Point.
expecting an answer, but it's just like that's in my mind.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that question. But yeah, as Mary said, this is kind of a different angle of addressing the questions that have already been asked and the discussions we've been having. And so as Mary said, we have obviously lots of polarization of climate issues happening, and there's already been a lot of discussion on how to better engage people, how to kind of recruit people. And so I think this question, we're just curious on what people have tried, and deep canvassing has been mentioned already. I know lots of you do tabling. I know lots of people do targeted meetings with people. I mentioned the chat of like, a kind of standing park meeting, hang, kind of more public place, hang, different like op-eds, whatnot. Happy to just kind of brainstorm and see what tactics works best for you. This doesn't need to be a laundry list of everything that your group does or anything that you've participated in, but I'm thinking, what do you find the most effective strategy that works in your communities? And maybe this depends on the season, like obviously not a lot of people are gonna want to be outside and doing a park hang in the middle of winter. But maybe that's when you transition into some sort of more cozier public space and have more of like a kind of cozy evening film screening instead of a outdoor picnic or something like that. Yeah, I think we all have to be nimble in these circumstances, and just seeing as Mary said, even too, the kind of benefits of the CEC network allows for people to learn from one another and really grow with each other. And so kind of in that spirit, this is a nice shared brainstorming time.
And bear in mind, the really interesting point is just in light of polarization, which of these become apparent that they're going to be less, that there's going to be more risks with them, and which ones start to feel like better solutions to move towards. Because I think that we've seen that public town hall type events where the planners, call for public input is endangered as a tool because of the way people are disrupting them. So what would work better, and what do we need to move away from?
Yeah, Gina, go ahead.
I don't have an answer. I have another, kind of like an add-on question. I don't know if I should add that at this point. Maybe I'll just put it in people's brains so people can also think about that. This is kind of like a question also related to like the examples back in the UK. So I was wondering, like, from the case of the UK where there's kind of been the split of Extinction Rebellion, that they're like moving on, and there's people, some of the more radical side are going into Just Stop Oil with like more extreme techniques to get their message across, and others have like started these hubs. What do you think, like, is there a parallel of that split? Because that's also polarization. Like, we're often talking about polarization in terms of like people who like support climate action versus those who are like no climate action. But like there's also like further polarization within the climate movement. And is there like a parallel in Canada that we might need to be aware of, or like are there ways that even can bring those people together, because those are both of those groups are committed to have like momentum in the climate, like in climate action. And so like what conversations are needed to facilitate engagement amongst people who have different ideas of what would be effective? Like, is that something we should also be thinking about? Sorry, that maybe it was like a bit of a big blob of
really
information.
I mean, I've been part of the UK movement, and I've been part of climate outreach, but also Extinction Rebellion. There's a very spirited debate going on all the time in the UK about tactics, and they even bring Marshall research, like the theories of change of climate outreach. There's a theory of change for Extinction Rebellion. They all have theories about why their way might be the most effective way, but really there's also in many people an acceptance that different tactics can coexist. So I'm not sure it's polarization always. It's just that sometimes people say, I think I'm more attracted to this tactic, and good for you that you're doing that one, but let's be supportive of each other. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that but sometimes it does, mean that they are polarized. Yeah. But it's a good point.
Thank you.
Great solution, great ideas here.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'll kind of say an example from Manitoba, actually, as at the beginning of the summer last year, there was our hub there helped start a Consider Climate campaign, because there was the Manitoba provincial election coming up in the fall. And they did a lot of tabling work. They were at every single farmer's market that summer. There were people who were just, I think that consistency, someone said something about consistency earlier too, with that physical space, but I think even just physical presence, having a consistent physical presence for people to know like that they can expect to have someone respond to their questions when they need to, that reliability, that kind of assurance is really resonates with people. And I think it really made people have take a second to think about these issues a little bit more, and almost what Mary said too about how, despite even if you have different opinions about different things, I think people really do just appreciate at the end of the day someone to talk to about these things. So
yes.
Yeah, Laura.
Oh, my computer's dying. Hang on, let me just plug it in. I didn't realize it was plugged in. Okay, there we go. Well, I think that these community things for polarization are really important. There's also another aspect of it, and I just wanted to bring it up before we, did come to a close, is that there's times when people have to show up at those, public meetings and be on the opposite side, because what has happened in our area in the West Kootenays is that, those places became overrun and elected reps heard one narrative, and we actually had a real, I'd say, a loss in our regional climate plan, where they heard so loudly from people, and I was actually told that from a board director, you got to get people out at that public time, and we had to scramble to get dozens of people to speak out about climate change, which seemed like such a no-brainer. You guys already know this, that this, but no, because they were hearing so many conspiracies, and they voted on some sort of weird compromise that everything has to have a business case and has to be a high priority for residents, and their public engagement were 20 open houses that were, most of them were sort of lightning rods for the conspiracy theory folks to come to, and a lot of people didn't want to go. They don't want to be in arguments with their neighbors, for example. And so there's times when I think there has to be a sort of a standing up as well. So the building community is great, but when you're in the middle of it, we can't just all think like we were like, oh, well, we'll all kind of get along, or, the elected leaders will see through it. And they were aggressive, the folks that were fighting against it, aggressive aggressive letters, to council, to the board, and and often aggressive at these events, but in the end, they sort of won, you know, that sort of showing up and being there. And so there is a certain bit of when a conspiracy theory based movement comes to squash local climate action, this is great for like building that community and repairing it either afterwards or before it comes together. But then there's that other piece of the necessity of being strong. And I just think there's a lot of things that we've learned, and it's I just don't want to happen in other communities, but I'm afraid that, you know, their success is going to like embolden. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And right now for that.
Really good point. I mean, when we brainstormed our list, the one I showed on the slide, you know, a lot of it is also things like letters to the editor, getting on those local community rant and rave sites on Facebook and countering some of what else other people are saying. And, you know, and some people are really like up for it and like, and others are like, that's hard, you know. So maybe there again are different tactics or different ways in which some people can contribute, and they can coexist.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
And one interesting thing is after that board meeting that was last month, the Kootenai Freedom folks had a potluck afterwards. You know, we didn't organize a potluck. Not potluck. They had a barbecue afterwards. They invited everybody out. So I did know one person that attended. I would have to attend virtually, but and he popped in, and you know, he had some good conversations. But you know, so you know, they were using this tactic, like
I know.
So and you know, they're our neighbors, right? And but they're pretty set in their ways.
Yeah, no, it's scary. It really is. Yeah. And really it's in many communities now. And they are our neighbors, and there's this kind of push and pull. Like we've talked about some of these people in our community, and there's this push of, I don't want to deal with that person anymore. And then there's this like pull of, but you know, that we still have a relationship with them. Like we can somehow use that relationship we have, you know, to somehow ensure, hopefully, that they don't completely go off the deep end in their behavior, you know, in public meetings and so on. Like I just feel like there's something there about still that we know them, you know, as community members. But I don't know. I'm still feeling my way on this.
Yeah, Keaton.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like finding maybe like the resolution, the solution is like, I think food, like everyone I believe agrees that like food is a good thing to bond over. And I think to deduce from that, like what it is that we're finding something in common that like, that is human, that is not political or like in general, something that is like a shared human experience that the majority of society can enjoy and not think of it as enormously political. And when we're in that type of setting, I studied psychology, so there is some backing to this. In that type of setting where like our focus is not on like we're not in a state of confrontation, like we're not put in a situation where we're feeling like we need to defend our politics, then we like have our guard down and are actually willing or more capable of listening to what each other have to say, and might be more willing and feel less defensive to create conversations around topics that we really do care about and that really do matter. So I think like finding more things like meals or like picnics or dining settings, like what are other examples of things we could think of that can like create that type of environment that people are comfortable have it like being in the same space, sharing a room or sharing a outdoor space to create those conversations that doesn't start from a point of we will be talking about this contentious issue. Those might be like interesting ways to like think about it.
I totally agree. And I did want to it reminded me of making a point about class a bit. Like England is such a good place to talk about class because they're so aware of it, and Canadians are always a little not as aware, I find. And I think one of the powerful things about one of the issues around what we're facing here is it's an issue of class. And one of the things I find attractive about a climate emergency center where you're doing things like repairing and sewing and cooking is that you're actually not so middle class in terms of the skills you're valuing. Like I remember doing a repair cafe here and just really appreciating the people who knew how to fix appliances, do the electrical things, fix the bikes, and it brought in all these people who wanted to help each other and wanted to help the community and could, but they would never have come to a meeting, you know, where middle class folk would be sitting there chatting about this and that. And, you know, so I don't know, there's something there as well for me about addressing the polarization, conspiracy-based polarization, which is about thinking hard about class and how to overcome and attract the people from working class backgrounds.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just switched the slide because I think we're already kind of talking about these things.
Yeah.
And looking through the chat as well, I mean, libraries are obviously such a huge institution that I think you know, I'm reminded of a book that is called Palaces for the People, and it's all about libraries, and it's all about how infrastructure wise, like they already do provide that perfect community space that kind of really valuing you know,
Yeah.
baseline access to everything, to information, to community, to skill building. You know, there's so much that libraries can give. And so this is, I mean, CECs are almost kind of a climate like
Version.
lens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you know, I know some of the hubs are doing a lot more of these sort of low barrier, very much tangible you know, activities, you could say, meetings, you could say, but like whatever you want to call them, that and not even necessarily calling it climate on a poster. You know, like there's a group in Scarborough that just had a little like week like day where they had like a repair cafe, a sewing mending workshop, clothing swap. Like I think clothing swaps are actually, as an aside, clothing swaps are actually really popular these days. I think people are really into that. But any sort of kind of low expectation that like people like kind of don't feel the pressure to you know, get involved in something later or have like an you know, intellectual conversation or you know, strategize or whatever, just wanting to be addressing things that they physically touch and know and understand innately are what it seems like people are really, you know, craving in life in a lot of ways. And then it almost is like the community comes second, the climate work comes second, the activism comes second. But once you kind of get that establishment of that kind of baseline foundation of skill building and of just being in the same spaces period with each other, is that's, you know, that's where it starts. Everyone's loving libraries in the chat. This is awesome.
Yeah, those are great.
Oh no, Lori, your library has locked communities out of the building. That's wild.
They have their own programs that they organize, and they are not renting the auditorium or any space. We only have like the auditorium, and they're not renting the auditorium to any group unless they sponsor it. And when you ask if they would sponsor it, they said no.
Yeah,
That's really frustrating.
yeah. Laura, I loved that example in the chat. Yeah, that you just gave.
The library event. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
the
was
library event where you countered misinformation with just direct experience and practical, you know, experience. And how can you counter that? Like the internet's telling you one thing, but here's some people who actually have heat pumps telling you something else.
It was really, it was a trial, and I'd be happy to share like the general outline because when I was talking to the person at the library, they thought this would be really a good, thing to share around the format we used, and just have community members be there. You're not the expert, but a lot, the people that were at the tables. And we also had somebody come from the Kootenai tribe, Kootenai Freedom, to sort of disrupt. And, I had a good experience at the table I was in where she was talking about her allergy to electricity or something, and electromagnetic waves, and how it forms, she gets bad headaches and stuff. And, I just took a breath, and I, looked at her and I said, wow, that must be hard. And she just like shifted the dialogue by using the empathy bit. And so just to remember, and to, when something's hard for somebody, to acknowledge that. And so I think that's a good
love that example. And I want to quote one quote I wanted to give at the end of my talk, which is from a CEC volunteer in England, and they're talking about conspiracy people. And she said, I think it's really important to understand how people are vulnerable to manipulative strategies, such as those from the fossil fuel industry. They are engaging with the arguments because they're vulnerable. Many are. There's massive economic, social, and political inequality that leaves people feeling powerless, voiceless, fearful of their ability to meet their basic needs, and trapped. Arguing with them about their denial is arguing with an overcompensatory coping mode that gets nowhere. It's about listening, understanding, and meeting underlying needs so that they are no longer vulnerable. Communities coming together and supporting each other will provide a sense of agency, being heard and valued, safety. Listen, empathize with how they're feeling beneath the anger, and focus on what we can do together.
Please share that with your follow-up resources. That's a great quote. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, what a beautiful way to end this call. I think that's so inspiring. And I will definitely get that quote from Mary so that I can send it to all of you. Oh, perfect. Thanks. Yeah.
The email, Hope, because I sometimes sort of cut and paste from the chat, and then it ends up being separate from a follow-up email, and it's just nice to have everything together. So that one and Jaden's quote.
Definitely.
Thanks.
Yes.
They have great comments. Yeah.
Your slides would be great too, Mary, if you're okay with sharing them, because there's a lot of things I was trying to take notes on, and it was, really good summaries on those slides.
Amazing. Okay, well, I will gather all of this information and send it all to you and anyone else who registered for the call. I will also send the recording in case you want to share it or watch back at any time. But thanks so much for spending a little bit of your morning with us. It's been really lovely. We have these calls every quarter, and so our next call something this summer. As you registered for this call, it probably gave you options to register for the rest of them. And so we'll be sending that out as well in the follow-up email, just that registration form in case you want to come on board for the other ones. And we usually have a guest like Mary come and grace us with any sort of wisdom that they may have, but also just a chance for us to all continue our relationships and learn about what everyone else is doing in the region. And I know that this summer is is looming, and folks are nervous about the wildfires, and so I might be in touch with a few of you about a potential webinar and resources that Climate Reality and potentially the Climate Justice Organizing Hub as well is working on to try to address that as well, because we know that's pressing. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your week, and thank you so much for joining again. And if you have any questions as well, feel free to reach out to me, to Michelina, to Laura, to Mary, all these people. I'll make sure to put that in my my follow-up email as well. But thank you.
Thanks, Hope.